Well, I was looking at the month of July, getting ready for this series of talks, and I realized that July has 5 Sundays in it. Now, to most ministers, that simply means an extra collection. However, for a Unity minister, it means that we have one Sunday to dedicate to each one of our 5 basic Unity principles, and I figured it's about time that we revisited them. So those of you who attend a Unity Center on any regular basis, you know that you don't get a statement of faith in your bulletin that you have to memorize or sign. We don't have a creed or a catechism or anything that we're required to work with. We don't have a secret handshake or anything either. No such thing as the Inquisition in Unity. No office of orthodoxy to root out heresy and force our ministers and spiritual leaders to conform to a certain agenda. And that kind of freedom doesn't mean that anything goes either, because we do have our own history, our tradition. We have key ideas, core ideas that we draw from, but the big difference is we study them. We question those ideas. Our founders wanted us to use reason and logic to test an idea rather than, carving it in stone and then bowing down to it. I think that's what a lot of people think of when they hear the word religion. They think about taking an idea or a commandment or whatever, carving it into stone, and then worshiping it like an idol. Blind faith. And that's why an increasing number of people, as I keep saying, are calling themselves spiritual but not religious. And I understand where they're coming from. But I also think we have to be careful, because what they often mean by that is they don't want structure. They don't want discipline. They go to the total opposite extreme. In Unity, we try to maintain a balance. We're spiritual, and yet there is structure to what we do. There's a certain discipline that we have to exercise in order to internalize and put the ideas into practice. So, despite the fact that we have no set statement of faith, there are certain ideas that form the foundation for what we do, and we allow them to change. We allow them to evolve. We question them, and that's why we revisit them every few years to see, how are they holding up? Are they still relevant? What needs to be changed? Is there any tweaking that needs to happen? This all started a little over 20 years ago. The folks at Unity World Headquarters wanted to see if our Unity teachings could be summarized for an article that was being published in the Daily Word magazine. So they called on Charles and Myrtle Fillmore's great-granddaughter, Connie Fillmore Bazzi, who was also a Unity minister, and she took on the task, and she's the one who formulated originally these 5 basic principles that she believed are the basis for what we teach. So this is the way they were originally worded when she came up with them. We'll start out with the first 3. God is absolute good, everywhere present. Number 2, human beings have a spark of divinity within them, the Christ Spirit within. They're very essences of God, and therefore they are also inherently good. Number 3, human beings create their experiences by the activity of their thinking. Everything in the manifest realm has its beginning in thought. And then number 4, prayer is creative thinking that heightens the connection with God-mind and therefore brings forth wisdom, healing, prosperity, and everything good. Number 5, here's the big one. This gets into the discipline and the structure that I was talking about before. Knowing and understanding the laws of life, also called truth, are not enough. A person must also live the truth that he or she knows. Some people objected. They thought that we were being forced to conform to some sort of a creed or catechism when these 5 principles were first drafted. Some people take a great deal of pride in Unity being like, as they say, trying to herd cats, right? It's very hard to get everybody on the same page. Well, I've never seen these principles as a danger. I see them as flexible. And what I find is that people who come to a Unity Center are going to look at these principles and they're going to be able to judge for themselves whether they like it, whether it makes sense to them, whether it's helpful. And if you look at the websites, go to different Unity Centers and see if they have the 5 basic principles on their website. I'll bet that in probably more than half the cases they've been changed. They've been tweaked, and we've done that here, and yet the essence generally remains the same. That is evolution at work. It's a wonderful thing. So even though our basic principles are not treated as a creed or a statement of faith, people who find us and stick with us find some value in them. And whatever teaching is being advanced, we still emphasize the fact that no one is required to accept it based on blind belief or any claim that they are somehow endorsed by an invisible or supernatural or channeled authority. We don't need that. We're empowered to look for evidence that a teaching or principle is practical, which means we can see it working repeatedly and reliably in the world, and then we make it work in our own lives. That's what it takes. So this morning, we're going to start with the first principle, which originally stated this: God is absolute good, everywhere present. All right, when I read that, there's a few questions that come to mind. For example, if God is absolute good and everywhere present, does that mean that everything is good? You know that popular catchphrase that we hear so often in pop culture? It's all good, man. It's all good, man. Right? Does that mean that everything is good? And of course we have a few pictures up here depicting racism, natural disasters, the possibility of nuclear destruction, poverty and things like that. Does that mean it's all good? If God is all good and everywhere present, then don't we have to say that everything's good? At one time, I think it might have been useful to use the word good in connection with God, because for many religious people, God was not always good. Read your Bible. God was also mean, nasty, vengeful, jealous, wrathful. This God hated stuff, hated people, really liked to smite people. All you have to do is think about the story of Noah. This God hated humankind so much that he decided, and it's always a he in those old iterations, he decided to kill every single person, every man, woman, child, and animal except for Noah and his family and the animals that they could fit on this ark. Everyone else was toast. That's genocide. Very plain and simple. And let these people that he thought were okay, that did not deserve his wrath, let them repopulate the earth. I always had some questions about how, they say that Noah's Ark landed on the peak of Mount Ararat, which they think is somewhere in Turkey. How'd the two kangaroos get all the way back to Australia on their own like that? They don't swim very well as far as I know, but anyway. At one time it was useful to use the word good in connection with God, because you would set up a stark contrast with that dysfunctional picture of God that I just related to you. You're telling the world that there's another way of looking at this nature of God, this concept of God that doesn't involve genocide at the very least. No wrath, no punishment, just what you could see as the good. So, let's drop the word good from that first basic principle and see what we come up with. You're left with this: God is absolute, everywhere present. Well, maybe we're getting somewhere. maybe that's a good start, but you know, it's still not right, because, well, I'm going to lay a highly technical term on you now for how that reads. It's clunky, right? It doesn't sing. You know what I'm saying? Which is why here at Unity of Auburn we decided to reframe this principle, and this is how we say it here. God is the name that we give to the source and essence of all that is. There is no other enduring power. I find it to be a lot more open-ended and unlimited, because when we use the word good, as nice as that word sounds, we're actually limiting our possibilities to what the human mind might judge as good, and that's often a very arbitrary distinction. One of those pictures I showed up there earlier showed a young African-American woman wanting to go to school with white children, and there were plenty of white people in that picture screaming at her because they didn't think that was a good thing at one time. And they were sure that their Bible said that it was good to exclude the races. A very arbitrary thing. When we use the word good, we so often define it according to the way we feel about something. If we like it, or if it feels good, or maybe causes no harm, or sometimes even when it does cause harm, but we still think the harm outweighs or the good outweighs the harm, we call it good. I think we can do better than that. Sometimes we use the word good to describe desirable human behavior, ethical behavior, but it always refers back to us, how we view the world, how we view our relationships. But are we justified? Are we justified in imposing our definition of good upon the entire universe? Is the universe good according to human standards? Is reality good according to human standards, or do we need to stop trying to force the universe and reality to conform to our needs, to our desires, to our expectations? The entire book of Job deals with that question. The good is and should be about setting standards for human conduct and interactions. That's an important thing. Reality, the universe, they simply are. And they are indifferent to our needs and expectations. Sunshine and rain, they're free. They fall abundantly and they nurture life. And they can also cause sunburn, skin cancer, floods. Can say the same thing about a lot of other natural phenomena. All we do is add another layer of discontent and suffering when we expect those things to be any other way. Our goal is to learn how to live in right relationship to that reality, to use our faculties of wisdom and understanding to discern how nature works and then act accordingly. And that reworded version of the first principle, it didn't just appear out of thin air. We didn't just make it up because, as I said earlier, we have our history, we have our tradition, we have teachings and ideas that go all the way back to the days of the founders. So that reworded first principle comes from some of the core ideas in unity that you can find in the work of Emily Cady. Now, this is a woman who was contracted by the Fillmores back in the 1890s. They wanted her to write a series of articles for a periodical they were publishing that tried to capture the core unity teachings. And those articles, that series of articles, was eventually compiled into a book called Lessons in Truth. As I said, published in the 1890s. Now, just because something is old doesn't automatically give it authority. Now, that's one of the fallacies that kind of floats around out there. If you can find something that's ancient, that must mean that it's authoritative. That does not necessarily hold true. But so far, Emily Cady's discussion of what we mean by God seems to be holding up very well. So this is what she wrote in Lessons in Truth. She said, God is the name we give to that unchangeable, inexorable principle at the source of all existence. To the individual consciousness, God takes on personality, but as the creative underlying cause of all things, he is principle impersonal. Now, other than the masculine pronouns, I think this idea has held up rather well. It's human consciousness that tends to personify God. That's what we do. Comes naturally. It's how we make sense of the world and the universe. We tend to take everything personally. And then when we do that, we tend to project our human qualities onto God and the universe, and voila, you get the God of the Bible who comforts and smites just like a cranky but loving parental figure. That's how it works. Emily Cady is trying to tell us that we can do better than that. We know better now. Well, we knew better then, and we certainly know better than that even now. And we need to vastly expand our consciousness and stop trying to force the universe to conform to the way we think and behave, because the way we think and behave isn't always that great. I actually think Emily Cady was pre-echoing, is that a concept? She was pre-echoing the words of a famous scientist who wrote this at a much later date. It seems to me that the idea of a personal God is an anthropological concept which I cannot take seriously. My views are near those of Spinoza. Admiration for the beauty of and belief in the logical simplicity of the order which we can grasp humbly and only imperfectly. I believe that we have to content ourselves with our imperfect knowledge and understanding and treat values and moral obligations as a purely human problem, the most important of all human problems. Albert Einstein. And not surprisingly, Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore, like Einstein, referred to Spinoza with approval. You'll find Charles talking about Spinoza in different writings, and I think that's probably where Charles got the whole idea of substance. If you hear the word substance being used in Unity, I'm thinking that probably goes back to Spinoza. So for Spinoza, the great Jewish philosopher, he said, to love God is to seek out knowledge and understanding of all that exists, of reality. And just to bring things all the way to this day and age, to our time, I'm going to leave you with a final quote from Carl Sagan, which I think is very much on point. He wrote this in a book called The Varieties of Scientific Experience. This is from a series of lectures that he did at the School of Theology, the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, which is a very prestigious thing to be asked to do. So he did this back in 1985, and he said, if a creator God exists, would he or she or it or whatever the appropriate pronoun is prefer a kind of sodden blockhead who worships while understanding nothing? Or would he prefer his votaries to admire the real universe in all its intricacy? I would suggest that science is, at least in part, informed worship. My deeply held belief is that if a God of anything like the traditional sort exists, then our curiosity and intelligence are provided by such a God. We would be unappreciative of those gifts if we suppressed our passion to explore the universe and ourselves. That's what I like most about Unity. Doesn't treat us like one of those sodden blockheads. Hallelujah! Can I get an amen? Amen. All right. We're treated like adults. and nothing is off limits to our exploration and inquiry. And there's a but here, and an and, right? Because you know what comes along with freedom. Couple of things. The first is responsibility. As Einstein observed, moral obligations are left to us. The universe is, we're the ones who are dealt with the moral, we're the ones who are left with the moral and ethical details to deal with, and those are the most important of human problems. So we have to keep learning better ways to take responsibility for what we learn and discover and use it for the benefit of humankind. And Einstein knew all too well how that worked, right? He's the one whose theory of relativity gave rise to nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The universe just is. You can split an atom and then you can use that energy for good or you can use it for evil. That is the human problem that we have to keep learning ways to deal with. So we have that responsibility. In addition to responsibility, there is sometimes a burden that comes with our freedom of exploration and inquiry, because sometimes we learn some truths that we would rather not have to accept. For example, it wasn't all that long ago that we believed that human beings were the absolute pinnacle of creation. That humankind and our intellect and our mind were the highest and greatest expression. Emily Cady believed that. And that's one of those things that, when you examine it, doesn't hold up so well, doesn't withstand the test of time as well as other things. That's okay. It doesn't hold up so well in light of what we've learned since then, because remember, Emily Cady was writing at a time when we knew nothing about the true age of the universe. We knew nothing about the Big Bang and how long it took for even the first proto-form of life to appear in the universe. She was writing before before the works of Charles Darwin were widely disseminated and understood. When you put those two things together, the Big Bang cosmology and Darwin's teachings, it leads to the conclusion that we're not the pinnacle, we are in process, just like everything else in the universe. And for a lot of people, that was a truth that was very, very hard to accept, and still is, because there are people who are fighting the theory of evolution tooth and nail. They are fighting the idea that the universe is 14 billion years old, tooth and nail, and just succeeding in adding more consternation, frustration, and suffering to their lives and to the world. We don't want to do that. We may not be the pinnacle, but we're learning that it's a pretty darn big universe, and it's not at all a bad thing to be part of. In fact, it's more than a little awesome if we're willing to grow in understanding along with it, which is why we keep going back and revisiting these principles, working on a way to remove those limitations and to expand and to be as expansive as this wonderful universe that we find ourselves in. So next week we'll move on to the second principle. We'll talk about that spark of divinity and ask the question, is that all there is? Have a safe and happy 4th of July, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.